Set? Okay. Well, welcome everyone to the March John Cain Luncheon. Just like to start by recognising that we meet on the lands of the Wurundjeri people today, talking about land and housing, which is particularly resonant when we're thinking about our acknowledgement of country. And we pay our respects to elders past and present. Today we are really lucky to be joined by Dr. Cam Murray. Cameron has been commenting on housing in some shape or form for, 2 decades now? A long time. His background is pretty broad. He's got experience in planning offices, with property developers, in academia, and now he is the chief economist of the Fresh Economic Thinking. Is it a think tank or a group, or how would you describe it as?
It's Australia's newest one-man think tank.
Yeah.
So go on fresheconomicthinking.com, put your email in, and you'll get an email every Sunday night.
Excellent. So Cam has written a wonderful book, the Great Housing Hijack, in which he talks about some of the reasons why the debate over housing prices, and the type of housing that we get in Australia, why the debate over that is so muddled, why some people want to hijack it, what incentives there are, and what some of the solutions might look like as well. So Cam's going to talk for, how long do you think, 20 minutes or so? As long as you want. You've got time. Yeah. And then I'll jump in with some comments and we'll open up to questions. So if everyone keeps your burning questions to the end, that'd be fantastic. And then Emma Dawson will finish us off at the end to discuss next week's JCL. Okay, this one. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Cam. So everybody, if you could put your hands together for Cam Murray.
Thank you. Oh. Oh. All right. Thanks for having me, Matt, and inviting me down to Melbourne today. I see you've put on the cool weather for me. That's a nice break. A nice break for me from the Queensland heat. Why don't I start by reading the book, since I'm here. Chapter 1 is called Dwelling Dreams. And it starts with a very familiar line. Third and final call. The gavel drops. The auction is over. A busy day at the auction hall has seen more than 30 landlords bid for the right to rent their property to the young Jones family. The opening bid was $3,000 a month. At that price, the prospective landlords stood no chance. At this auction, all the landlords who gathered feared missing out on a tenant. Almost immediately, the landlord of a nearby property offered their similar home for $2,200 a month. A neighbouring landlord quickly responded. Then a third jumped in. After more than a dozen bids, the winning landlord offered their best price, $1,270 per month for a 3-bedroom cottage, and won the auction to buy the Jones family as tenants at the lowest possible price. Like all auctions, the winner was stretched to their financial limit. The winning landlord offered a price that barely covered their costs, but it was a risk they thought was worth taking. All the properties at the auction had been inspected by the Joneses and were all of a high quality and a location they desired. The family knew that when the auction was over, they would have secured the home they want at the best price possible. The housing market worked. They were jubilant. But then the Jones family awoke. Cheap housing, whether renting or purchasing, is unfortunately just a dream for many young families, whether that's the Great Australian Dream, the Canadian Dream, the American Dream, the British Dream. These deeply ingrained cultural aspirations are increasingly not matching reality. That story is there to get us, firstly, to switch our brains on by being a little unexpected, but secondly, it is there for us to think about the housing market and what we expect of it. Because you will find a lot of debates these days about the housing market and how we're going to make the housing market better and how the housing market is going to do this or that. But the housing market's never done what the Joneses dreamed it would do. Consider a quote from a celebrity visiting Sydney. This celebrity said, "The number of large houses just finished and others building is truly surprising. Nevertheless, everyone complains of the high rents and difficulty in procuring a house." That was not Taylor Swift in February 2020. What are we, 2024? Time flies. That was Charles Darwin in January 1836, on the first day in his diary when he visited on the HMS Beagle. Little changed. Fast forward to the 20th century. In 1910, the New South Wales government commissioned University of Sydney academic Robert F. Irvine to investigate the problem of rising housing rents. The report he produced in 1913 led to the 1915 Fair Rents Act in New South Wales. But little changed. 1919, the Interstate Commission conducted the Piddington Inquiry into rising housing rents. And there were many inquiries since. When they met to discuss after the Second World War, key public Australian officials noted this about the housing conditions of the early 20th century. They wrote, "Cheap, mean houses were built all around and between the factories, with no legislative restrictions to set even modest standards of space and light, or even the humanitarian considerations of health or privacy. Row upon row of workers' dwellings were jammed into every street. Land values rose with the high industrial potential. This was reflected in the rates and the added rents until this spiral of values reached a stage where one family could not afford one terrace home. These were then subdivided to cram more people in, and so began the overcrowding that exists today." We can also look, where's my other favourite quote? We can also look to the future of online game worlds. Lars Doucet is a game designer from Texas, and he explains that property bubbles, property busts, property recessions, and housing crises in online game worlds are nothing new. If this is the case, then it's a little bit puzzling to me that we expect the housing market to do something that we dream about, but throughout history it is never done. That is a little bit of a confusion, which brings me to my main points that I actually want to talk about today. And there are two. What is this housing crisis we think of, and why do we think the market is going to make it better? And secondly, what can we expect the housing market to do, and how can our policies change the outcomes? So let's do a little bit of audience participation. Are you ready for that? Did you get that on the email? No? I want to see by show of hands, who's a homeowner in the room? Hands up, keep them up high. Keep your hands up if you're having a housing crisis this year in 2024, worst of your living memory. Okay. Hands down, all the homeowners. Hands up, the renters. Keep your hands up if you're having the worst housing crisis in your memory. Quite interesting, isn't it? You can put your hands down. The housing crisis is not everybody's housing crisis. Typically, when I do this, we get around 2/3 or a little bit more homeowners, and almost all of them put their hands down. They're not having a crisis. And that represents what's going on out there. 2/3 of Australian households are homeowners. Very few of them paid the current price because they bought many years ago, and they're fine. They're not having a crisis. Usually, I get a few more renters, and I get about half of them keep their hand up. And that represents what's going out there in the broader community. Around 30% of households are renters in the private market, but only about half of them are really having problems with housing. So this housing crisis, if we think about all the households in the country, is a crisis for half of 1/3 of households. Yes, half, yeah, 1/6. Do the maths on the fly. For the other households, including the 18% of households who are landlords, we're seeing the best period for housing investment ever. And I think we've got to understand there's this deep symmetry at the heart of the housing market that is the reason why it's so hard to define what the housing crisis is. It is also why I argue that the debate is hijacked, because there are so many interest groups on both sides of this economic symmetry that seek to confuse because they don't want to be on the losing side if anything really does change. I surveyed my Twitter followers a few years back. It was actually only 1 year back. Gee, lots happened since. And this is what they said to me when I said, what's wrong with the housing market today? Some of them said, there's too much density in the suburbs. Others said, there's not enough density in the suburbs. Some said, we must tax property more. Others said, there are too many taxes on property. Some said there's too many investor buyers. Others said there's too few investor buyers for the rental market. Some said there's too many renters. And others said there's too few renters. We should have more renters. Some said we need tiny homes. That's going to be the solution. Others, we need better homes. Some people said we need fast trains and transit infrastructure. Others said there's too much infrastructure waste. Of course, some people said mortgage rates are too low. And as you'd expect, others said the mortgage rates are too high. Some people said there's too many vacant homes. Some said there's not enough vacant homes. What do you notice? We all think the housing market is a problem, but we all think it's a problem for opposite reasons. And that is why we're in this debate that has been going on for not just 100 years, but 200 years in Australia about the price of housing. Our debate is hijacked by certain interest groups who don't want to be on the losing end if prices go down. They don't want to have a vacant rental property. They want to have a renter bidding against another renter or queuing up around the street and paying them a bigger income for their retirement or for their investment. So that's the story. I'm not going to get into the hijacked part of the debate. We know, for example, that politicians must be aware of this symmetry of property markets. They must be aware that if they were successful in making housing cheap, just 30% lower in price, getting nominal prices back to where they were pre-COVID, that would wipe $3 trillion off the balance sheets of 2/3 of their electorate. Something they would never do. When Lucy Ellis, who's the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank, was asked by the Felinsky inquiry, where are the examples of governments through policy changes orchestrating large declines in the price of housing assets and rental? And she said to that inquiry, there are no examples of governments making homes cheaper. They only get cheaper during economic recessions and depressions. And of course, when that happens, we do our very best to try and avoid it. It wasn't that long ago, just the second half of the 2010s, rents and prices were falling. And we did a lot of policy change, including monetary policy, to try and reverse that. So here's the question. What can the market do? What outcomes do we get from the market? In the book, I argue there are 5 important, what I call equilibria. So in economics, there's this idea that when we trade, we get to an equilibrium outcome. And I'm going to just maybe discuss a couple of them because they're very relevant to the policy questions today. The first one is the asset price equilibrium. And maybe before I get there, I will just explain this idea a little bit more. When you're at the supermarket and there are 2 checkouts open and there is a queue at each one, if there's a queue of 10 people at one and 2 at the other, is that an equilibrium? It is not. Why? Because you can trade between Q1 and Q2, checkout 1 and checkout 2. You can move and line up at the other one. And so when 4 of those people shift from that queue of 10 to the other one, there's 6 in each and there's no advantage from switching lines, right? And that's what we call an economic equilibrium. It's the market outcome of people's choices to trade so that there are no beneficial trades left in the market. Why do I say that? Because in our public debate about housing, we talk about things like we will make house prices cheaper. How? Right? Houses are one of many assets in the economy, one of many supermarket checkout queues that I can take $1, I can take $1 out of BHP shares and I can put it into housing, right? And if the price of housing went down, that means the yield, the income I get per dollar goes up. So everyone's going to switch out of those other assets and buy houses to push the yield, the price back up and the yield back down so that we're back at the equilibrium. So when I hear someone, oh, prices are determined by supply and demand, I say, yeah, well, prices are also determined by the person who wrote the price on the contract, but that doesn't tell us about why that price was accepted by the seller and why that price was willing to be paid by the buyer. But do you know what does tell us? The equilibrium in asset markets when we can compare the cost of money by taking it out of other assets. So we can't just make property prices fall. That's why they fall during a recession or a depression, because the returns on all assets fall. Everyone becomes risk averse and the yields rise. So that's asset pricing. And they can't just go up either, right? Yields in Sydney housing, world's worst. They're 5%. That is, you buy $1 million house, you get $50,000 of rent. Do you know what they were 10 years ago? 5%. Do you know what they were 20 years ago? 5%. If you study, and if you go on Google Scholar and look up studies with headlines such as the rate of return on everything over 500 years, where people have gone and they've looked at every asset class in the economy, they find that property makes the same rate of return as every other asset. It's slightly different in different years, of course, because everyone's trying to second guess and adjust, just like people might switch halfway through the checkout queue. But they always make the same rate of return and have done for hundreds of years. That also means that prices can't just go up, right? Prices are set by the behavior of trading within the broader asset market. So when people go, it's supply and demand, that's why. No, the prices are set in the asset market based on the rate of yield, which is the rental income. So the rental income, okay, but surely, right? Surely rents would go up because of supply and demand or whatever we're talking about. But the two supermarket checkout queues, there's an equilibrium there too. And maybe you won't believe me, but I can assure you this is true. In 2021, the typical renter household in Australia paid 20% of their disposable, their after-tax income on rent. In 2011, the typical renter household in Australia paid 20% of their household disposable income on rent. In 2001, these were all surveys, the Survey of Income and Housing from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. It was 20%. And in 1991, the first of those surveys, it was 20%. And in fact, if you go back to that 1911 rent inquiry in Sydney, you'll find that some of the analysis said rents should be about 20%. 20% of a worker's salary is what the rents should be. So we've got this bizarre situation where, on the one hand, we've apparently got the worst crisis ever, and on the other hand, rents compared to incomes have been the same for perhaps a century, with a bit of a mid-century anomaly, but at least the last 40 years. So this is the other question about where rents come from. We can't just make rents go down, just like we can't just make prices go down. Because what happens when rents fall? People relocate into bigger and better houses. They take from their spending, they can either spend on non-housing goods and services or housing, and they take from this and they spend on that because their return's better. And over time, we move into smaller households, so fewer people per dwelling, bigger dwellings, and better locations, until we get to that 20%, where that trade-off of, I've got a nice car and a good job, should I move to a bigger house? Yeah, I'd have, but I won't go to a better house until I get a pay rise. You see what I'm saying? And across the market, that's the outcome we get. So we have a lot of talk about, how to make rents cheap, but unless we can somehow limit those trades, just like how we must limit the trades in asset markets to change the price, the market will adjust. and we'll spend 20% of our income on rents, and buyers of houses will pay based on the rate of return of other assets in the economy. So that's what the market can do. So we've got a lot of questions, policy questions, for example, where that sort of information is relevant. We talk about things like remove stamp duty and make prices cheaper. But we know a tax on buying an asset makes the asset worth less, not more. If I taxed you to buy BHP shares $5 every time you bought one, BHP shares would be worth $5 less because you want to pay the same total amount to get that yield on the asset. So stamp duties make the sticker price of housing lower. What is another policy? We talk about immigration a lot these days, and it's true that temporarily immigration can change rents, but it's not true over time because we must adjust, right, by moving to different households and changing our location to spend that 20% of income on rents. So although, yes, there's a short-term disruption, just like there's a short-term disruption when incomes rise, we had record immigration in the 2010s and rents fell for 5 years straight. 20% nominally in some parts of Sydney between 2017 and 2022. So these are sort of the foundation ideas. I'm going to open it up for questions soon because I think it's more interesting. But when you all get the book, and I'm going to give this book to the best question from the audience today because I'm an economist and incentives matter. You'll read about the 3 other equilibria, more about politicians and their own personal investments in property, the role of the media, and everything else you've ever wanted to know about housing. So I might just leave it there.
Can you just cover housemate?
Housemate?
Yeah.
Good question. Yeah. You really want this book, don't you? So where does this lead me at the end of the book? Thanks for that, Matt. Yeah, let's wrap that up. The housing market is doing today what it's always done. This is predictable. In May 2020, during COVID, when we'd started decreasing interest rates and everyone was panicked about prices falling 30%, I said on a podcast, house prices are more likely to rise 20% than fall 20% because you've got to understand the interest rate has come down and now it's much, much cheaper to swap out of other assets into housing. Or as I put it for home buyers, the price of renting money has gotten so cheap compared to the price of renting a house, I'm going to switch from renting a house into renting money with a mortgage. And that's what we did. We actually had record first home buying. We had essentially 5 years of first home buying in 2.5 years during COVID. So the market outcomes are predictable. Every part of the cycle, of course the market's not steady all the time, it cycles. We get the same debates. We had them in the 1910s, the 1930s, the 1970s, the 1980s. We're having them again. When I looked around the world, I thought, well, we've got to be able to improve on this, surely. The places I found that had the best housing outcomes had large non-market housing sectors. So instead of my original point, we got 70% of people, but just about 2/3, happy with the housing market, they're homeowners. Remember, and we've got 1/3 or 30% in private renters, and only half of them, right, are having a crisis. If we could build up over a decade a non-market home ownership or rental system, I'm very open to the interpretation of it, but I love the Singapore model where you buy your house at a discount from the public developer and you can trade within that parallel system because it outsources the management, it gives you the freedom and flexibility to renovate. There's no conflict between the incentives of the landlord, and the occupant. If we could build that up to 10 or 15% of the housing stock over the next decade, then in the next market cycle, in 20 years, when rents are rapidly rising as they are today, we'll solve most of the problem. Because remember, that's only that 10 or 15% of the market that's having a crisis. And if they have a better option, okay, of buying or renting from the public developer, the problem's solved. Now, people tell me, oh, this is naive, this is student politics, it's impossible. You're telling me the government can just build 1 million homes over a decade or two and get this share of people. out of private rental? And I say, yeah, that of course we can. Sweden, after the Second World War, built 1 million homes in 5 years. Okay? Singapore, after independence, took home ownership from 20% to 88% in 25 years through their public home ownership system. We, after the Second World War, had massive public housing, and we took home ownership in the cities up from the early 40% to 71% by 1970, mostly through subsidising people into buying their public housing off the government. So I think it's possible, and as I say to people, if we were debating schooling before the public schools system was created, and someone stood on stage and said, well, you know what I think the solution is to this high cost of education and this inequality of access? I think we should just build schools everywhere and let kids go for free. And you'd be called a crazy, naive student politician who doesn't know what they're talking about. And then we did it, and now we all think it's great, and we lobby for better spending, more spending, better schools, because the system works. And I think it will be the same with Housemate, is what I call my proposed public home ownership scheme. But any implementation of that, I can imagine in 20 years our kids going, yeah, I want that opportunity. If I have to move to the city, I'm going to get a housemate and I'm going to live there because I know it's a good option for me. So that's where I get to. Look, if we could fix housing with tax tweaks, upzoning, I'd be there. I'd be talking about that right here, right? But there's no stamp duty in New Zealand, and they're having the same conversations about housing, right? There's no little tax tweaks or upzoning that's going to do it. There were essentially no taxes when Charles Darwin wrote his diary. There was no federal government. There was no zoning. It was the same problem then. I'm going to stop and I'm going to ask for questions. Remember, a copy of the book is on the line. Let's do it. Thank you.
Good idea.
Thank you. Oh, thanks. So we'll start here, and then you had one. Yeah, 1 and 2.
I've read the book, so I don't need it. Basically, I'm just going to make a very quick. I've got a question. I think this housemate's suggestion looks good. I lived in Sweden for 20 years, so I know about that system. Unfortunately, that system is not as good as it was in the 70s, but that's another question. My question is, being an advocate for public housing, in your book, you talk about a combination of buying, rental, and cheap price, which I know from the English system as well. But you also mentioned public housing. Now, there are many advocates in the housing issue that say public housing in itself is a solution to the problem. So what do you think about the actual, that building 200,000 public housing would be a solution to the problem? What do you think about that kind of suggestion?
Do you mean rental housing?
No,
income?
Public housing.
Yeah. That is, rents are,
Rent.
you rent it and the rent is contingent on your income. Is that what you mean?
So basically,
Yeah.
and all the concessions will go with public housing.
Yeah, I think we should build heaps of it. I guess where I differ is I think everyone should get the option, just like public school and public hospital. If you want political buy-in, you need everyone to access it, because maybe their kids will benefit from it. Maybe the politician's family will see benefits from it. And I think that's the difference. And that's why I propose selling also and saying you can buy this at a discount, because that gets this universal buy-in. So in Singapore, for instance, most people own, but there are a few percent who still rent from the public housing provider. I'll give you an example of some prices I looked up. $9,000 rent for 10 years in the seniors rental program. That's $900 a year. It's essentially a nominal figure. So I'm a big fan of that. But I think you'll capture a lot of people if you can have home ownership. So for example, compared to market prices in Singapore, you're talking about between a third and a half the market price for the public homes to purchase. So people there can also use their superannuation to pay a deposit and pay the mortgage, because their first pillar of retirement is a paid off home. So as soon as you're 21, you can apply if you're as a couple household for one of those. So I think income contingency, I think, doesn't get as much political buy-in. That's, sorry, a very long-winded way of saying that one point, but yes. Sorry, we had a question here.
Yes, I'm just interested in how you get to 20% rent over a period of time. So 20% of the
The household total household income
the total.
for renter households. So this is
There's an enormous difference between a single mother
there
and
is.
two lawyers or a lawyer and an accountant and a household. How does that look?
Well, it's the median of a big distribution. So if you look at a plot of the survey, so it's the rental price paid. How could I describe it? It's like a banana on its side. If you put all the data points out, where the x-axis is the household income and the y-axis is the share of income spent on rent, and it's from your direction it looks like this. So the higher your income, the lower the share, and then there's a big cluster here, right? And then there's some low-income people with very high proportion. And predominantly that high part of the banana is welfare recipients and renting pensioners. And then the mean of that and the median are very close, actually, down in the meat of the banana. So yeah, it's 20% as a market outcome, not everyone's 20%. And that, like the supermarket checkout, it's the length of the queue is the market outcome. It's not an individual's outcome.
So that doesn't take into account the fact that one person's got a litre of milk and somebody else has got a supermarket trolley overflowing.
No, it's just the average of everybody who rents. Not everybody, the 8,000 people in the survey. Yeah. Is that the answer?
No, it's not. I think life's a bit more complicated and nuanced. But the other thing, maybe the word crisis we're using too liberally because there's a crisis in London with a Photoshop photo. Clearly a crisis. And so we hear every day
Yeah.
about the housing crisis. What does it mean?
I'm totally with you. I think we should, I'm going to add crisis to the list of words we should not use talking about housing. Supply, demand, and crisis. If we could describe what we mean instead of using those words, I think we'd get a long way of agreeing on what the problem is rather than being able to use those words and have one person think we need to tax property more, another we need to tax property less, one we need to get more homeowners and one we need more landlords. So yeah, I think I definitely agree with you. The media loves it, of course, and housing in Australia, as I talk about in the book, the media will just do what the audience wants. They will say anything for the clicks. Whether the prices are rising or falling, you'll know about best suburb to invest in Sydney, suburb with the biggest price declines in Sydney. You'll find out about record home buying, the 8-year-old girl who bought a house. I don't know if you saw that one this week, you know, her family put a house in her name. Okay, that's not news, but do you know how many clicks it got? So yeah, I'm totally with you. Let's go. One there, 2, 3. Yeah, you go.
A little bit of an elephant in the room, which is the value of land. And the value of land has risen enormously because of the amount of finance sloshing around the world globally, especially since the GFC, which has been invested in property, not in business, not in manufacturing, not in the real economy. And Australia from the beginning has been a country where people have tried to make money out of the land itself, either through mining and the big boom to Australia's growth and economy, and the effect on it was gold.
Yeah.
That huge amount of gold money funded the land boom in Victoria
Correct.
in the 1880s, which only took us till 1938 to begin to recover from. So that when the housing crisis, which was a crisis after the Second World War, very similar in many ways to that now, what they had left with is a huge increase in demand from returned servicemen who wanted to get married. They couldn't get into houses because they were rent controlled and had controlled tenants, and a very large amount of the housing stock had degraded to being slums. And the people that owned those slums had had rent controls or themselves had been trying to live off property investment because they had no other form of liquidity. And so they became landlords who were as poor as their tenants. And if you look at the list of people who are listed as slum landlords at the back of the 1937 Slum Reclamation Report, they're nearly all single women or widows. Because that was the way people paid for their old age. Now we've got superannuation, we don't need to do this. Now what's been going on in this country is that the people, agency which has got people land or got them on the property ladder
Mm.
has been government. Started with land grants to
Mhm.
colonists, it started with land grants to ex-convicts, it went on to the Selection Act, then it became the Closer Settlement Acts, then it became the War Service Homes First World War, then it became War Service Homes the thing. So the extent by 1970,
Mhm.
according to Michael Jones, 37% of housing in Australia had been built by government. Look, and so
Yep.
opening sentence of that book, which was a seminal book on public housing in Australia, where they found that in fact building high-rise flats here cost $19,000 then per flat compared to spending $10,000 to build a simple house in Reservoir.
Mhm.
But in Melbourne was built huge amounts of our suburbs, and similarly in Sydney were built by the housing company.
Yeah, exactly.
So public investment. The most intelligent investment that ever happened was the miners' right in 1858, where
Mhm.
for a guinea a year you could have a quarter-acre block in a mining town, and you could hand that to your children. And if you were widowed, you kept it. If your husband buggered off, you kept it.
Mhm.
And people lived on those mining rights of the mining
Yep.
towns for 100 years.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
that provided, just a minute, that provided, no, I'm not, see, this is serious, because what we've got now, it's not funny because we have an extraordinarily inflated value of property, which is driven by what you do, which is personal wealth building through speculation.
Mhm.
And that value of property just doesn't affect housing. It affects every single element of the economy. Every
Mhm.
cup of coffee you buy has built into it the cost of the property
Mhm.
that the people who produce that coffee,
Mhm.
deliver it to you and serve it up to you have to pay for. So throughout the whole economy, people are making money, as they always have, by betting on inflation.
Yep.
So what the property market does is drive inflation. Wages have to try and catch up, but they never will. And a whole lot of people, all of us in this room mostly included, because of our age, because of the historical period we did, have made wealth through inflation without work. So this is the way you make money without working and without contributing to your actual economy. So the crisis of conflicts of interest you describe, Karl Marx had a lot to say about that. It would be a good idea perhaps you looked at that, and if we're talking about this fundamental class conflict between those who have and those who don't,
Yep.
and we will have an increasing proportion of the younger population which is growing, who will be educated, frustrated, unable to buy property. They can only use parental wealth, and they'll have to hope that their parents only had one child.
Mhm.
So that's a rant, but
Yep.
it needs to be said because the one thing we leave out all the time is the cost of land,
Mhm.
and we have now reached the point where we have an acute shortage of land where people want to live, and that applies to all world cities.
Mhm. All right. Thank you. Did you have a specific question? Do you have a? I'm just wondering if you're a fan of taxing land to redistribute it, or you'd rather redistribute the land. Because that's when I get this is
That's going to be very difficult. I mean, you've got land tax in ACT.
Mhm.
That usually ends up because a lot of people can't pay it as
Mhm.
they go. So you've got a problem with people who own property but are income poor in
Mhm.
old age, and that's an issue now.
Yep.
So that is one way of doing it. But then, of course, who owns the land in the ACT? The government does. So you're paying a ground rent. Now,
Yeah,
what we do with it, I don't know, but I agree with you
Mhm.
that we have to build an alternative housing sector on the collective public money, which enables people to have a home and which they have housing security, but they can't speculate on it.
Yep.
They can't use
Great.
it to build personal wealth, which is what I think Singapore is doing.
So I agree. It's a summary. I mean, there's a lot of points you made. The land question, yeah, I talk about Marx and Engels in here just very briefly because I want to sort of say it how I see it today and more recent history. But yeah, it's always been the case, this unequal access to land, and you're right about the history of, well, actually, we have allocated the land without prices to people to give them a share. And that's what I propose with a public home ownership scheme. So that was a good history.
In Victoria now, no one's talking about how much this government has done in social and public.
Yeah.
Massive investment.
It-
It's going on all
it-
around.
It just takes time, right? And I think there's not, it's not as flashy as, I've decreased taxes on someone who's going to say nice things about me in the press. It's a slow grind that happens over time. In Queensland, the state government's been buying hotels and a couple of retirement villages from investment funds that had vacant retirement villages to get people off the social housing waiting list. So there are good things happening, which is nice to see. I just really hope they last, because rents won't keep rising forever. I remember back in 2005, a friend of mine was doing some teaching at QUT in Brisbane at university and said to me, I'm thinking of living in my car for a few months because the rents are so ridiculous in Brisbane. And we had a homelessness boom then as well. But by the middle of the 2010s, rents in Brisbane didn't rise nominally for 10 years during the 2010s. So we just have to make sure that those investments keep happening when it's not a crisis anymore, or when things stabilise. So the next time around, we have those homes and people in them, and we have the institutions ready to accelerate what they're doing. So, good point. I better give Matt a question, because he's hosting us.
Yeah.
Let's go.
All right. So I think I want to come back to the question over here around. Okay. So what I think when you're using your equilibrium examples in the book,
Mm-hmm.
there is a loss of detail by definition, I suppose, in the sense that what fascinates me and disturbs me most about the housing market over the last 30, 40 years is the growth in inequality between generations, like the slowing of access to ownership for young generations, the effect of increasing rent stress on the bottom 10%, and that's been a secular increase from the 80s until the late 2020s. So, and I think this carries through into your policy prescription, which is allow anyone to access the homes. You know, right now we have 70,000 odd families on the extreme needs social housing waiting lists. Very high number historically speaking. So I think in your analysis there is this maybe a tendency to look at the median and skip over some of these incredibly disturbing social trends, and then when it comes to the policy prescription, not to say, okay, well, the crisis is there, we start there, we don't open up housemate to everyone straight away, because we must address this first. This is the actual crisis. We can exclude all the fluff around what is a crisis, but that's where we should go. So I just wondered how you feel about that kind of.
Yeah, I guess in principle what you're saying is housing and income inequality are inextricably linked, and therefore we should start at the bottom. Yep, that's fine. I mean, we already give welfare recipients rent assistance for that reason. I'm a big fan of just going to pre-sales and buying homes under construction, right? If you want to put people in homes, just go and buy them. Just like the Queensland government just went and bought a hotel, and now people are in them. That was only 2 months ago, right? So, and during COVID, amazingly, we could house how many thousand in quarantine camps because we wanted to? How many people did we get off the street and put in hotels when we wanted to? So yeah, it's a matter of political will. I just think if you want this to persist, because if you look outside of Sydney and Melbourne, rents went nowhere for more than 10 years. Why, if I'm a government, what am I doing? I'm wasting everyone's money building this stuff. So I think the universality makes it stick. But yeah, you definitely focus at the bottom. But as a general point also, a big trend in social housing is to mix income levels in the same suburb. And so I think making it universal does that automatically. Rather than having, for example, in Sydney there's a big debate about Waterloo being redeveloped and selling off certain buildings and not others. Like, if it's a good investment for the private sector to own that building, it's a good investment for the public sector. I talk about the magic suits that Treasury has. They go to work and they put their suit on, they go, oh, housing, that's so expensive, what a waste, we shouldn't build houses. Terrible waste of money. And they go home, they take the suit off, they call their broker, can I have $1 million for a house in Sydney? It's the best investment ever. I'm like, which is it, mate? Like, is it a good investment or is it not? And so I think, yeah, you definitely want to use the universality as a selling point and for integrating people. But yeah, there are urgent rehousing needs. We have a debate in Queensland. The quarantine camp at Pinkenba is a federal government facility, and there's just political fighting about letting the state or the city use it to house homeless for temporary shelters. They've been waiting a year, leaving it empty. Good point. 2 more over here.
Yeah.
Yep. Questions though? We've got to be going in 10 minutes, right?
Okay. Have you heard of a Dutch auction?
Yeah, I write about a Dutch auction in here.
Oh, excellent. Okay, right.
Okay, next question. No, we had one here. Did you have anything further?
Oh, no, I was only going to make a comment that Mrs. Beaton went and said you shouldn't spend more than 20%
Oh,
of your disposable
fair
income on your household. That includes the servants, the
on your
facilities, all the rest of it.
yeah, well, yeah, my servants and my children. It's very cheap. Their pocket money. Yeah.
Social housing as a policy terminology.
Yep.
Bad.
I don't like the words social, affordable, and public. I think they're, again, very confusing. I want to say this is subsidised housing with incomes set to market at a percentage below, or it's subsidised housing with rents set to incomes. What is it? Like, what do you pay to be there, and how do you get there? How do you qualify? If you could just be, we could be more descriptive, because there's a lot of talk about, oh, the social housing sector or this and that. I'm like, 20% below $1,000 a week is still $800 a week. How do I get on that list, right? So yeah, I think we should be more clear about the way we allocate and the price that people can occupy, and define housing types based on that. Either it's allocated by price, it's allocated as a discount on the market price, or it's allocated based on a share of your income. Does that make sense? You got one more question?
No, we've got time for one.
Well, I better give James
Just a quick one.
quick.
I know in your prior book, Game of Mates, you dive into the political power realities of in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
And do you see a situation in Australia where it's sort of a tyranny of the majority when it comes to housing, where the majority will always persecute the renters,
Yeah, the temporary embarrassed millionaires. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of that in housing. But just to be clear, we did have record first home buying during COVID. And to be clear, if we zoom out, rents didn't go anywhere outside of Sydney and Melbourne from the financial crisis until after COVID either. And so every time I go somewhere to speak, I'll share this with you. If I go to New Zealand, Vancouver, Sydney, you name it, everyone says to me, oh yeah, but we're the worst for housing, aren't we? No, but the prices here are worse, right? And if it's in Sydney, it's like, oh yeah, but it's because of the harbour and the immigration, they come here, so it's the worst here. And then in Vancouver, oh no, it's the worst here because of the planning system. And then in New Zealand, no, it's the worst here because our incomes are low and we're bad at investing in infrastructure. And everywhere I go, I tell people, you realise every city I speak at thinks they're the worst? Perhaps we should have some perspective and go, yes, we are all participating in this market, just like on those online computer game worlds and just like in the 1800s. It always feels like we're the worst because everyone is stretching to their limit to outbid each other or move to a bigger and better place. But I just think we need to be much more realistic about what the markets can and can't do. So for example, when rents rising since COVID, a lot of that has been because incomes went up. For the bottom 20% of people, their nominal incomes went up 15% in 2023. All the tradies made bucket loads of money, and the number of people employed per household went up, and the number of hours they worked went up. And what did they do? Well, they bought houses and they moved to better locations and paid more rent to outbid the person who was already there. That's a good thing. Okay, it's a good thing. But we've got to understand that that's what the market does. Okay, last one then, hey?
Okay, so in the book, the title is
The Great Housing Hijack.
The Hijack. We're talking about the debate, right? The premise.
Yes.
Debate. And
Which I haven't really talked about.
Well, this
I'm glad
is
you.
a question, right? So the policy solution that you come to is housemate.
Yeah.
How do we? That's a policy solution for a broken housing system, but not for a broken housing debate. What are the solutions to fixing the housing debate removing those vested interests,
Yeah.
circumventing these new fads and whatever else it might be?
Geez, that's a good question, and I wish I had a better solution. One, read The Great Housing Hijack. Two, stop using the words supply, demand, crisis. What were the other ones we were going to talk about? Social housing, affordability. Okay, start saying what you mean, meaning what you say. Acknowledge the interests. I have a hard time. An example I write about is in Queensland. I think it was last year. On a Monday morning, 9 a.m., the Premier announced, we're going to look at limiting how quickly landlords can increase rents in Queensland, which I think is totally reasonable. That's something can be done immediately. And in Queensland, we already limit how quickly land tax can be increased each year. So landlords already have rent control for land tax. If it's good enough for them, maybe it's good enough for their tenants. And so the land tax one, they average out the last 3 years' land valuation. So if your land value doubles in 1 year, you don't pay double land tax, you pay 30% more. And then you pay 30% more. And then you pay 30% more. Because we know it's very disruptive. So for tenants, we should do the same. Back to the debate question, that was 9 a.m. on a Monday. The Premier said, yeah, we're going to look into this. 6 o'clock news Monday night, every real estate lobby group, the Real Estate Institute of Queensland, the Property Council of Australia's got their makeup on. They're out at ABC, at South Bank. Oh, this is bad for renters. Don't you get it? Like, you know, landlords will leave the market and rents will go up. Someone just has to turn around and ask, are you telling me that this policy will make your rents go up? That's good for the people you represent because it's their income and you don't want it? Are you a really bad lobbyist? Have you hit your head on the way here? Or are you just lying? In which case, I won't ask you any more questions. I'll ask someone else. No one will do that, right? The media is lazy about that. All you've got to, and I think the trend is happening now of people asking politicians, how much would you like house prices to fall? 20%? 30%? Give me a number. Because I'm going to put it on the headline of the newspaper tomorrow. I want prices to be 30% lower. Well, that's not going to happen, right? Because you get voted out. Because remember, everyone wants prices to go up, or everyone. The majority of voters want prices to go up. So I think if we can just take that first step over those humps of, can we be honest what we're talking about? You keep saying affordability. You don't want prices to go down. What is it you want? And why don't you just do the thing you want? Oh, I would like someone to be able to buy a house in this suburb for this price. Okay, go and build it and sell it to them for that price. If that's what you want, you can do it any time. What's stopping you specifically? These are the questions we could ask. And I'm hoping, this book, my talks, groups, Matt's efforts can go some way to improving that.
Great.
Thanks for having me. Should we vote on best question? Matt's were pretty good. I actually didn't mind yours. A good history. Where should we go? Let's bring it over here. Can I unplug it? No.
Is it still on? All right. Great. Thanks so much, Cam. Wonderful talk. We're going to wrap up now, but thanks again. That was fantastic. Lots of challenging things to think about and talk about as we continue on this housing crisis journey to affordable housing. Emma, I will pass over to you now to talk about next session.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Cameron. It is a very provocative and interesting read. You won't agree with all of it, but these things are absolutely imperative if we're going to have a real conversation about the kind of country we want to be. So thank you for joining us today. The other thing, of course, you can do is sign up to support the Centre for Equitable Housing at Per Capita and support Matt and Lucy's work in this space as well. I didn't see you at the start, so it's lovely to see you all. I just want to tell you about our John Cain lunch next month. We're going to push it back a week. I hope that doesn't disrupt anyone's social calendar too much. It will be on April the 24th instead of the 17th. And that's so that we could accommodate a guest we're really keen to get along, which is Paul Tilley, who has a new book coming out next month called Mixed Fortunes, A History of Tax Reform in Australia. So it'll be a miserable read, won't it? I think given the fact that everything we're talking about here, I mean, as much as, you know, Cameron doesn't want us to talk about supply and demand anymore and crises and so on, there absolutely is a need to undertake meaningful tax reform across the economy in the country. We currently incentivise all the wrong things through our tax system. We do not demand that businesses invest adequately in innovation and in R&D. We have incentivised far too much money going into unproductive assets like land. And so I'm very confident that what Paul will give us is an overview of where we've gone wrong in the past. There have been instances of good tax reform in Australia, but most of them were while I was in high school, and I'm 52. So please join us on the 24th of April to hear from Paul. Look forward to seeing you then. Thanks a lot.